I wanted to ask you about aquaculture. In Nova Scotia in particular, as you know, they're trying to introduce, the government of Nova Scotia is introducing a strategy. There are a number of communities that are extremely concerned about the impact of open pen fish farms on the traditional fishery, in particular lobsters, and the role of your department in ensuring that proper assessments and monitoring enforcement is done is very important. And I raise that also in connection with what Justice Cohen said about aquaculture on the West Coast in his recommendation number 3, when he said that the Government of Canada should remove from the Department of Fisheries and Ocean mandate the promotion of salmon farming as an industry and farm salmon as a product, that there was a conflict between the mandate to protect fish and fish habitat and the promotion of salmon farming as an industry and farm salmon as a product. So in that context, I'd like you to provide for me some answer as to how it is your department is going to provide any comfort to the people that are concerned about the impact of farm salmon, farming salmon on the in Nova Scotia.
I guess there are a number of questions within your question, so I'll talk briefly about how the department approaches the management of aquaculture generally and in Nova Scotia in particular. I think the first and the most overriding principle of our approach is that we're fundamentally committed to the protection of marine ecosystems and all the species within them. Certainly that's our abiding concern, whether it's in Nova Scotia or British Columbia or anywhere else in the country. We're fairly confident, very confident, that aquaculture can be conducted in open net pen structures in a manner that is consistent with that objective. That's not to say that it's a non-impact-oriented industry. It clearly needs to be regulated. It needs to be managed very, very closely and effectively. And as you probably know, jurisdiction for aquaculture is shared in our country, particularly in Nova Scotia. There's a different regime in place in British Columbia, which we could talk about if one wished. But in Nova Scotia, the jurisdiction for the management of aquaculture is shared between the federal and provincial governments. The predominant element or the preponderance of the regulatory regime is provincial in Nova Scotia. The province issues leases to individual farm operators that allow them to secure a particular plot, if you will, of the ocean. And so the first component of the regulatory regime is to determine where in the province aquaculture will be authorized. In addition to a lease, an operator requires a license from the province, and the license from the province is extremely detailed in nature. There are a whole series of environmental provisions and requirements that must be obeyed by the operator. We have worked with all provinces, including Nova Scotia, with respect to the content of some of those license provisions, how they're structured, what the regulatory tools are, what the standards to be met are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, the federal government does have a role both in terms of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, but more broadly within the Department of Transport Canada, and the Navigable Waters Protection Act. There are other departments involved as well. To some degree, Environment Canada is a player in the regulation of the aquaculture industry. But certainly from our perspective, we participate in the environmental assessments of all sites. We participate in the sense of contributing science to the decision-making in both the provincial context and federally. And we work quite closely with the province to make sure that all sites that are considered are, at least from our vantage point, put in places that don't cause a significant threat to not just wild salmon, but to any wild species. So, to sum up, and obviously this is a topic that would require further discussion if we wanted to get into it in huge detail, but from our perspective, the strategy that the Government of Nova Scotia is advancing for that province, for aquaculture, is one that is prudent. It's moving forward in due course, but it's not a rapid development approach. It's one that we're quite comfortable with and that we've worked with them on. We're confident that the regulatory regimes that both the province and ourselves manage are sufficient, more than sufficient, to effectively protect the ecosystems involved and to go forward with a sustainable industry.